So a man was sent to prison for life for the murder of his wife based on one single piece of evidence, what appeared to be a bite mark on her arm. But now it turns out all of that is based on junk science. And even though the entire scientific process behind the only piece of evidence against this guy has been debunked, he's still in jail. Right? And notably, this is just one piece of an ongoing crisis in the criminal justice system of people getting convicted on disproven forensics. We're talking about methods that are presented as scientific fact, but they lack sufficient research or evidence to support them, and they're often highly subjective. Things like bite marks, as well as blood spatter and 911 call analyses. And the debate around the constitutional rights of people who have been convicted on now debunked methods, it's garnered a lot more attention recently after the Supreme Court denied the appeal of a high-profile case, declining to weigh in on the matter. With this crisis also being highlighted even more in a historic statement written by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, a statement which experts said marked the first time a high court justice has weighed in on the matter. And so the case in question there centered around an Alabama man by the name of Charles McCrory. In 1985, his wife Julie was found murdered in her home by blows to the head and stab wounds on her chest, while their 3-year-old son Chad was left unharmed in his crib. Notably, at the time, Charles and Julie had been separated, right? She had found out that he'd been having an affair, and so he moved out. But according to reports, the two were still on good terms, and they saw each other often, including at Julie's house the night before her murder. We saw very quickly in this police making Charles their only suspect, with him getting tried and convicted not long after. But for the nearly 4 decades since, Charles has insisted that he is innocent, a claim that's also been echoed by a growing number of others, including the Innocence Project and McCrory's now grown son, Chad. And that's largely because there's basically no physical evidence connecting Charles McCrory to the murder, at least any credible evidence. Right, the investigators, they searched Julie's home as well as Charles's apartment and car, but they never found anything linking him to the crime. There were no bloody footprints or fingerprints or murder weapon. Hairs found on Julie's body were identified only as her own, and while Charles's fingerprints were found around the house, that wasn't incriminating at all because he was there so often. And in addition to the lack of evidence, there were also numerous issues with how law enforcement officials conducted their probe, like the fact that their search was hardly thorough enough and that they ignored some potentially very important evidence altogether. Like, for example, the investigators didn't inspect the kitchen knives or other sharp utensils in Julie's house, even though she had been stabbed. And the fingerprint examiner, they barely dusted anything at all, even key parts of the house that could have provided evidence, including, very notably, 2 windows in the master bedroom that were found open and could have been used by the murderer to enter the house. And perhaps most damning, they also didn't investigate another potential suspect who had worked at an excavating company next to McCrory's, a potential suspect who also committed a home invasion and rape of another local woman just weeks after Julie's murder. And so with nothing but some weak circumstantial evidence, the prosecutors latched on to one last hope to tie Charles to Julie's murder: 2 small indentations found on her arm that they argued were made by his teeth marks. And to prove their claims, prosecutors brought in Richard Souvron, a forensic dentist who had recently been a star witness in the trial of Ted Bundy. And in his initial observations, Souvron wrote that McCrory had unique dentition because he had been born without an upper incisor, which left a distinct space between his upper left front tooth and upper left canine. And so as a result, the forensic dentist concluded that the marks in the arm could have been made by the teeth of Mr. Charles McCrory. But, key thing here, Souvron also explicitly said that the marks could not be definitively linked to McCrory's teeth, writing, "It is impossible, in my opinion, unless very unusual circumstances exist, to make a positive identification from 2 teeth of a bite mark," with him going on to add that the indentations only showed 2 upper teeth, which is odd because the upper jaw is fixed and the lower teeth are the ones that grab and hold. What's more, he also noted that the defense could argue that the marks were made by the same instrument that was used to inflict the stab wounds on Julie's chest, with him ultimately concluding that the marks, quote, "would be of some value only if there is a substantial amount of additional evidence such as fingerprints, blood, hair, semen, etc." With Souvron even going as far to state that it is not in the best interest of justice to use those injuries as the only means of identifying the murderer. But that is exactly what happened, and Souvron played a key role. Despite clearly stating in his initial findings that he couldn't unequivocally link McCrory to the marks, he said almost the exact opposite when he took the stand, telling jurors that the evidence was solid and that he could conclusively match the indentations to McCrory's specific dentition. And the jury, they bought it, because why wouldn't they? With him ultimately convicting McCrory almost entirely on the bite mark testimony, with the mark serving as the only piece of physical evidence. But now since then, bite mark analysis has been totally debunked as junk science that has resulted in dozens of people being wrongfully convicted. In fact, according to the Innocence Project, McCrory is actually the last remaining person known to have been convicted almost entirely on bite mark forensics, right? I mean, over the last decade, numerous studies and 4 governmental scientific bodies have concluded that the practice has 0 basis in science. And research has reportedly disproven the 2 foundational claims it's based on, not only finding that human dentition isn't actually unique like DNA, so any number of teeth could match a mark, but also that skin is a bad medium to accurately accurately record injury because it's malleable and it can change over time with healing and decomposition. Also, some studies have even shown that experts can't consistently agree on whether injuries are bite marks, including one where 60% of board-certified forensic dentists misidentified an injury made by a box cutter as a bite mark. So, as a result, forensic dentists who used to believe in bite mark analysis, they've now widely disavowed the practice. And in recent years, at least 36 people have been exonerated after being wrongfully convicted based on bite mark forensics. And while the Innocence Project has tried to do the same for McCrory, they haven't been successful. And that's despite the fact that back in 2019, Souvran recanted his testimony, effectively taking away the only link to physical evidence against McCrory, writing, "I no longer believe the individualized teeth marks comparison testimony I offered in his case was reliable or proper. I no longer believe, as I did at the time of the trial, that there is a valid scientific basis for concluding that the injury found on the skin of the victim in this case, assuming that the injury is in fact teeth marks, could be matched or otherwise connected to a specific individual, such as Mr. McCrory." But even though the crux of the case had been dismantled, prosecutors fought back, and in 2021, the Covington County Circuit Court held an evidentiary hearing. And there, McCrory's defense presented testimony from two of the top forensic dentists who used to believe in bite mark analysis, but have since denounced it, with them arguing that there was no scientific basis for the claim that the two marks on Julie's arms were even made by teeth, or that McCrory's supposedly unique dentition had made them. With the defense also noting that the current DA had offered to let McCrory out of prison in exchange for a guilty plea, but he refused because he didn't want to admit to a crime he didn't commit. But then on the other side, you had prosecutors arguing that even without Souvran's testimony, there was still enough circumstantial evidence and that the jurors themselves could have compared molds of McCrory's teeth with photos of Julie's injury to see if they matched. So basically, they were arguing that the jurors should have engaged in junk science themselves, even though they're not experts. With the court then ultimately buying those arguments and siding with the prosecution, denying McCrory's request for a new trial. And so his lawyers appealed, but then the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, they also denied the motion, siding with the lower court. So they then brought the matter to the Supreme Court, asking the justices to decide if Americans have a constitutional right not to be convicted based on forensic evidence later shown to be fundamentally unreliable. And of course, we know that the court declined to hear that review. But notably, in her statement, Sotomayor said the only reason she was denying the case was because the constitutional questions it raises has not yet percolated sufficiently in the lower courts to merit this court's review. And very significantly here, she noted there do need to be more remedies for people who have been convicted based on junk science. Because even though science itself has now debunked those forensic methods, the law hasn't caught up with her writing. Hundreds, if not thousands of innocent people may currently be incarcerated despite a modern consensus that the central piece of evidence at their trials lacked any scientific basis. There is no direct mechanism built into the law that allows courts to revisit or correct cases for most people convicted based on junk science. And that's largely because legal statutes for that process were written before scientific achievements and didn't anticipate an entire field being debunked. As well as, the fact that the American legal system favors finality, so it's hard to challenge convictions based on junk science once someone's been sent to prison. But there you have Sotomayor arguing that the debunking of junk science goes beyond normal attempts to overturn convictions. Right? Evidence that an entire mode of forensic analysis has no scientific basis, however, is of a different category from evidence that might call into question a witness's credibility or motive to testify. Now, of course, there, establishing a constitutional right would clear all that up. And although the justices have made clear that the question needs to stew in the lower courts longer before they can take it up, Sotomayor argued that state legislatures and Congress need not wait for this court to address a constitutional remedy. They're going on there to point out that Texas and California have enacted statutes that create avenues for defendants to appeal convictions based on junk science. And they've actually both been used successfully in at least a few cases. But ultimately, for now, we're gonna have to wait to see if, the renewed attention here prompts more lawmakers to act. And then also with that, if these cases will be challenged in lower courts in the hopes of eventually taking the question back to SCOTUS. But again, all of this playing out as McCrory and untold numbers of innocent people just wait in prison.